I want to pick up the story of Nehemiah. I've been doing it in a sort of a Bible study style, message for the sermon. And this is actually part 4. By this time, and we're going to pick up the chapter 4 in Nehemiah. And by this time, Nehemiah had gone through his desire before God to be able to go back into Jerusalem after he heard the bad news of what the conditions were and what the people were facing. He had prayed before God. He had fasted for about 4 months. And we've gone through the concept of part 1 of Nehemiah, a man of prayer. Part 2, Nehemiah, a man of vision. Part 3, Nehemiah, a man of passion. And part 4, what we're going to speak on today, is Nehemiah, a man of conviction. And what we've got laid out before us in the book of Nehemiah is God has given us an example of the conditions of a generation having to rebuild after trauma. Because my mind went to that coming back into New Orleans following Katrina. Now, I don't know if anyone here saw a news report this week. It's called post-stress disorder in relationship to the hurricane. And I listened to that report, and I was quite amazed that I don't know how they come up with some of this stuff. I mean, one of the things you can tell you're going through distress if after 3 months of the incident you're still thinking about it and it's on your mind all the time. I said, well, most of the people can't even get back in their homes. Of course it's going to be on their minds all the time. If you're having difficulty sometimes dealing with the stress. You know, I called yesterday, fussing with an insurance adjuster, and one was upset with me because I didn't wait past 20 minutes for him to come into the house because I had other things to go do, and I've waited 3 months for them. And you know, and you go through these things, and you can see in Nehemiah's mind, he was going through this stress of the condition of what it was in Jerusalem. He wasn't there. He had a very nice position as the king's cupbearer, but he thought beyond himself, and he thought about the conditions of those around them. And one of the biggest keys to overcoming the stress of the conditions we live in today is you think about the other person. And God helps you to deal with your own in a lot better fashion. It makes it a lot easier to deal with it. The problems are still there, but it's how you cope with them. And then we went through and we saw how Nehemiah was given in his heart, as Nehemiah stated, he says, God put in my heart to do that work. And we went through Daniel, how God, it says, from the time that the order was given to rebuild Jerusalem. And quite possibly that's the time. And there's no way to confirm that, but it sure looks like that. Is that was the time of the rebuilding of Jerusalem, because it actually began the rebuilding there, and it was another 70 years before that part of the prophecy of rebuilding took place. We went through the 70 weeks. We went through his passion and his desire to accomplish the goal. And I think there's so many examples through this for his vision and his passion that we, as a people, as an end-time generation, we're going to have that. But there's one thing we must have. And if we don't have it, we'll never hold fast when stress comes, is you have to have the conviction of your beliefs. The conviction of your beliefs. Because it's not enough to believe what God says. Satan does that. In fact, Satan knows the Bible better than we do. We're going to have the conviction to live by what we believe. And the trials, the persecution, the attacks will come from ways you never dreamed of. They'll come out of left field. You'll be having a conversation. All of a sudden, you'll be under attack, and you don't know where it came from. And you'll be almost forced to look into how you can get around your beliefs. Well, Nehemiah was one who had a goal. He had an objective, and he had a conviction, and there was no one going to stop what he did. So now I want to pick up the story of Nehemiah in chapter 4 in verse 1. But so it happened when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, that he was furious and very indignant, and he mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren. I got something stuck in my throat all of a sudden. Excuse me, I'm really sorry about that. And he mocked the Jews, and he spoke before his brethren in the army of Samaria. Excuse me, one more time. And he said, what are these feeble Jews doing? And do you know that's kind of the way the world looks at us as a people and as a church? You know, thank you. What are these people doing? Who do they think they are? Because, you know, you're just a handful of people who believe in the Sabbath day. Excuse me. And we can look at the rest of the world and know how they feel about us. It's that our beliefs are contrary to theirs. And then when God begins to raise up the work or a work, no matter where it's at, individually, collectively, you will find objection almost immediately faces you. Almost immediately. You know, Satan is the god of this world. And when God begins to do something, the two spirits can't mesh. So if God's doing something in your life, there's a goal, something that you feel strongly about, that you're about doing, and is contrary to what this world believes, immediately you're going to find some type of opposition. And that's what we see here with Sanballat. Sanballat became very indignant. And looking at it says, who do these people think they are? These feeble Jews. You know, that term is weak-minded, and basically not able to accomplish anything. Who do these people think they are? What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? In other words, the statement means is, will they be able to gather materials to be able to build back this wall, the gates? Will they be able to fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? And we've seen as they began to build the sheep's gate, one of the first things they did was they built the sheep's gate, which was right by the temple, and they sanctified it. They set it apart for the holy purpose, and which normally included some type of a sacrificial rite. Now, what is it like in New Orleans? Now, a lot of people don't understand the concept of Mardi Gras, which you can't really go along with the concept. But in New Orleans, what's the thing they do that's going to make the world see that we're back on our feet again? Mardi Gras. So what they're trying to do is portray that New Orleans is coming back because this is going to generate income, and they're going to have Mardi Gras. So the rest of the world, so they're looking in that direction. Well, for the Jews, when they were able to sacrifice, that gave them time of the glory days, the time when Jerusalem was strong. And what they were trying to do here is they were giving them the aspect that there's hope for this civilization. You know, that's what the city's doing here, whether we believe it or not or agree with it. Of course, we certainly don't agree with it. But that's what they're trying to do, because that's what made them successful. One of the things they did anyway. So they want to go back into the thing that looks like New Orleans is back on its feet again. That and gambling. Of course, gambling got shut down real quick. You heard about that time they're going to take a whole section of the city and make a big gambling block, look like a mini Las Vegas down here? Because that didn't get off the ground. Will they sacrifice? Will they complete it in a day? In other words, they're going to go about this so fast, there's no way they're going to get this done. Will they revive stones from the heaps of rubbish? And when you go into look into this later in the chapter, you'll see that there was so much debris, and the walls had collapsed, and stones and wood and fires, that the people had to actually walk around the rubbish and the trash that was laying in the streets so they can get through the gates. And so they're saying, are they going to take all this trash? Are they going to build from these trash? They're going to fortify themselves? Where are they going to get their material from? So you can begin to see the concept of what he was up against. Now, you picture us at the end time. You picture a worldwide, there's going to be at least the two witnesses that we know of out there who's going to be beginning to preach, and the whole world's going to take notice of what's taking place. People are going to hate what they got to say. And they'll look at us and they'll say, well, do you go along with this? And of course you'll say, well, you know, they're preaching the truth, and this is what the Bible says, let me show you. And they'll say, oh, you're one of them. The reason we're in this condition is because of you people. And you can go through the Bible, and that's pretty much the way it lays it out. He goes through, and he says, now Tobiah, the Ammonite, was beside him and said, whatever they build, even if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. So you can see the mocking that was taking place. It's like these people, they can't accomplish nothing. And then he goes on to say now, verse 4, he says, Hear, O God, hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads. Give them as plunder to the land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity. Do not let their sin be blotted out from before you, for they have provoked you to anger before the builders. I mean, he just turned around telling God, give them what for? And he puts it in God's hands. And he goes on and says, so we built the wall. So he was never discouraged from what was going on. No matter what people said about him, he was focused to get the work done. So we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Now it happened that when Sanballat and Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, the Ashdodites, heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being stored. Now do you notice how many people he's got stirred up? Now, one of the things I'm going to get into by the end of the sermon is showing you a concept of persecution, what generally takes place. One of the first things that happens is you hit the wall of objection by somebody. Because normally if there's a work of God going on, it's got to move aside an evil work that's out there to make way for God. Just like going into the promised land, God had to make way, and he moved away all the other nations, and he brought in the children of Israel. And when Jesus Christ returns, what he's going to do? He's going to take this entire world and he's going to just bring it to its knees and to make way for God's righteous kingdom to come in and step place. When you do a work, understand, generally, in most cases, something has to be displaced. That's not always the case, but in most cases it is. Someone's feelings, someone's emotions, someone's finances, someone's power. And that's what's going on here. There's men here that were running Jerusalem, and they had to be displaced when Nehemiah came in. So now they didn't get their way, so the first thing happens is the objection. Second thing that happens is they begin to raise up enemies to support their position, because it didn't work on their own. So now they have to go solicit support. And I'm going to show you some New Testament examples of that later today. So he goes on and see all these different people came in, the different nations. He says, and they heard that Jerusalem were being built, were being restored, and the gaps were beginning to be closed. They became very angry. And all of them conspired together to come and to attack Jerusalem and to create confusion. So now the plan goes out to destroy these feeble Jews who they were not able to stop with their mocking. Have you ever been through that before? That you know when you raised your opposition to someone, it was just a matter of time they were going to come get you. Maybe it was a position in your job because you wouldn't go along with something. Or maybe because God gave you favor that you could keep the Sabbath day and your co-workers have to work, you find yourself in conflict with those around you. And then you find they'll go to their co-workers and their friends and say, what do you think about this? Next thing you know, you're under the gun and you don't know why. And then they have to give in, and all of a sudden you come under attack. Well, that's what's going on here. So it says they became very angry, they conspired. It says, verse 9, nevertheless, we made our prayer to our God, and because of them we set a watch against them day and night. Now, Matthew Henry's commentary, I'm going to read you some from Matthew Henry's commentary in relationship to this, because he puts it in just a few words very adequately. It says, God has many ways of bringing to light, and so of bringing to naught, bringing to light and bringing to naught, the devices and designs of his church's enemies. If our enemies cannot frighten us from duty or deceive us into sin, they cannot hurt us. Now understand that. All right, let me read that again, what he says. God has many ways of bringing to light whatever it is he has for you to do. God has many ways of bringing that to light. And so bringing to naught. Now what we're going to see here is that God knew what these enemies were going to do against Nehemiah, and actually the plan that God had wanted for Nehemiah. He brought to light what the enemy was doing, and he brings it to naught. So that's what he's saying. He goes on, and it says, and if our enemies cannot frighten us from duty or deceive us into sin, they cannot hurt us. Years ago, I was asked the question, what are you afraid of losing? Every person needs to be honest enough to ask yourself that question. What am I afraid of losing? Now you think about that for just a moment. I don't know if you've ever asked yourself that or not. What are you afraid of losing? If there's anything in your mind that you're actually afraid of losing, now I bet many of you used to say, I really don't want to lose my home. And it's gone for many cases. It's gone. You know, in some cases, just a slab there. If there's nothing that you're afraid to lose, there's nothing that they can do to you. We realize that. Now, that's what Matthew Henry's commentary is trying to tell us here. And that is the point where Nehemiah reached. There's not a thing they can do to me. It's very simplistic, but it's very true. If there's nothing that you have to worry about losing, if you're willing to give it all up. Now, isn't that what Jesus Christ told us? He says, those who are not willing to give it up for my name's sake, those who seek to save their lives are going to lose it. You've got to reach the point that in your commitment before God, in the plan that He has for you, you must be willing to give it all up. And if you're willing to give it all up, it's in your mind, you're set, it's done, there's not a thing they can do to you. And that's what Matthew Henry's commentary is trying to tell us here. This is the concept of Nehemiah. There was nothing they could do to him. He wasn't afraid. He had a focus. He basically, as the king's cupbearer, when he left that position and he went into Jerusalem, he was willing to give it all up, and he was going to focus on that work, and that was it. There was nothing that anyone was going to do to stop him. What about us as people in God's church? Not an organization. I'm talking about the body of Jesus Christ. In our minds, in our focus, we cannot reach the point that there's anything that we say, well, I will go this far, but I'm not doing that. Because if there's a holdout, if there's anything in your mind that will hold you back from serving God, then you have a problem. Now, the next thing will probably happen. God knows what that is. He knows our every thought. If there's anything inside of you, inside of me, that you're willing, that you're not going to give up, or you're struggling to go through, a fear, a concern, a doubt, what he's also saying here is God has many ways of bringing to light. Just like the plan of what was coming with Sanballat, God knows what your weaknesses are, and what He will do, He will help you overcome your weaknesses. Let us hope we can go to God with our own weaknesses before He has to bring us to our knees to help us overcome those. Because years ago when I first began to work within a church, the question came to me one day, and I didn't really know how to answer the question. It says, God doesn't really want me to go without my home. This was a person struggling about the Sabbath day, making a living. He really doesn't want me to suffer. You know, and I'm thinking through that question. I'm saying, well, no, He really doesn't. You know, but sometime later I come to the understanding. I said, yes, He does. If there is anything in your life that holds you back from serving God and going to His kingdom, yes, He wants you to go through that to remove that obstacle so that you can have eternal life. If you're not capable of doing it yourself, He will bring it to light and bring you to the point that you will have to face it one-on-one. It's almost as if you stand in front of the mirror and you look at that obstacle and said, if I don't overcome this problem, I'm not going to be in the kingdom. And sometimes it means losing homes. Sometimes it means losing jobs. Sometimes it means losing health, to bring you to the point where you can serve God with a whole heart so that you can be in the kingdom. Now, only the individual can evaluate themselves to be able to decide if that's true or not. Now, usually about this time there's an altar call when you watch this on TV somewhere, and of course they're asking for money, but we're not doing that. I'm trying to get to the point to know that there must be a conviction in each one of us. In each one of our responses toward God is going to be different, because each one has a different calling, and only you can know that. So I thought that was quite extraordinary on this commentary, what he wrote in that little brief passage. Now, verse 10, let's go on. Then Judah said, the strength of the laborers are failing, and there is so much rubbish that we are not able to build the wall. And that's what we were reading earlier about all the rubbish and the trash that was around, is that they couldn't wholly get the work done because the place was in such ruin, in such decay, that it was wearing them out. They weren't able to build the wall. And our adversaries said, they will neither know or see anything till we come in their midst and kill them and cause the work to cease. So what we see is we have all these nations now. You have these feeble Jews, as they're referred to. You have Nehemiah, and those who had volunteered to do the work of God to rebuild those gates and those walls. They were rebuilding the sheep's gate. They began to have to see the sanctification, setting it aside for that special purpose. They're near the temple, and the people were gaining hope. And now they see this conspiracy taking place, and then information about the conspiracy came to them. And they were beginning to get that information that there was so much trash that they were going to be able to come into the city, go through the trash. And as the history records it, there was tunnels through the trash because there was so much debris, and they were able to sneak in, and they're going to sneak up on these people as they built and kill them all. Now that's what they're up against. That's what they're up against. It says, we will kill them and cause the work to cease. And so it was when the Jews who dwelt near them came, and they told us 10 times. God had placed people outside the wall who were of the nation of Judea, who had came back from 2 previous returns, because this is the third return of the Jews back into Jerusalem. You see Nehemiah, if you go look into the history, you'll find that there was 3 successive waves of the return of the Jews back into Jerusalem. Well, this is the 3rd wave, where there were those who actually lived right outside the walls in the community who actually were not working on the walls yet. And God had allowed them to be in such places as to be able to hear the conspiracy taking place. And these people would actually go into the walls, and they would come to Nehemiah 10 times, it says. 10 times they brought with information from all around the city saying that these people are going to come in, they're going to kill you guys. And that's just began to go through the grapevine. And so they began to be real concerned. So instead of stopping, it says, so in verse 12, let me pick that up. It says, so it was that the Jews who dwelt near them came, and they told us 10 times, for whatsoever place you turn, they will be upon us. It says, you're not going to get away from these people. Therefore, instead of turning away, instead of drawing back, therefore I positioned men behind the lower parts of the wall at the openings, and I set the people according to their families with their swords and their spears and their bows. And I looked, and I arose, and I said to the nobles of the leaders and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. When we look at prophecy at the end time, I can see clearly there will be times that you and I are going to be tested for our lives' sake. When you look at Revelation, and it says, how long, O Lord, till we are avenged? You know the passage. You've heard it probably. If you've been in a church, you've probably heard that many times over. And God says, until your brethren like you are also martyred. So there's coming at the end time another coming martyrdom to try to stop God's people from going forward. It says, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren and your sons and your daughters and your wives and your houses. There's a man that was totally convicted of his purpose in life. Because of his conviction, it gave the people the strength it needed at a time of terror to go on and to fight, to do the job. In verse 15, and it happened that when our enemies heard that it was known to us, in other words, that God let them know that the people were aware they were coming and they were prepared. Evidently, from what we're seeing here, the only way to stop the Jews who were building the wall was to sneak upon them in a covert attack to stop what they were doing. When it became known that the Jews inside the wall was aware of what was going on outside the wall and that they were going to come into attack and they were prepared to fight and they weren't going to stop, it goes on to say, it says, when it was known to us and that God had brought their plot to nothing, that all of us returned to the wall and everyone to his work. The sheer fact that they had the faith to stand up against this opposition put enough fear in those people who were going to attack them. Now we're talking about a small group of the Jews who are building a wall versus, you remember all the names that we read? The Arabs, the Ammonites, the Ashdodites, and all. So we're talking about nations of people outside were afraid to come in because they were prepared for them. Verse 16, so it was from that time on that half of my servants worked at the construction, while the other half held spears and the shears and bows, and they wore armor, and the leaders were behind the house of Judah, so that those who built on the wall and those that carried the burdens loaded themselves, so that from one hand they worked at the construction, and with the other hand they had weapon. Now there is some commentary as to the way this is written, where they actually had a sword in one hand and they worked with one hand. Or what it might mean from some of the commentaries is that it's possible that half of them was on duty with swords while the other half was working, which makes a lot of sense, but it's not quite clear from the Hebrew the way it's written, but it does mean it was like half the time is working and the other half of the time they're protecting themselves. And every one of the builders had his sword girded at his side as he built, and the one who sounded the trumpet was beside me. And this is written in the first-person narrative from Nehemiah. So what he's saying is that they all built, some protected, some worked, and the person who gave the alarm stood right there by Nehemiah. Then I said to the nobles and the rulers and the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive, and we are separated far from one another on the wall. So whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there, and God will fight for us. Now, it reminds me of God's people today, is that the work is great, but we're so spread out, we're so small, is that we got to use telephones and emails and communication to be able to touch base with one another to see what's going on. And basically, that's what he's saying here. Verse 21, so we worked. So we labored in the work. Half the men held spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. In the same time, all the people said, let each man and his servant stay in night in Jerusalem, that we may be guard by night and the working party by day. So neither I, my brethren, and my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me took off our clothes. Now these people are so dedicated, they didn't even change their clothes except to go wash them once in a while. I mean, these people were really, really working. So now that is the condition of a man who, from the very beginning of this goal, this task that God gave him, was opposed by those. Now chapter 5 is like an inset chapter. I won't go through all of 5 because of the time, but it's worth reading because it gives you the condition that the people were in at that time. But what I want to cover in chapter 5, just briefly, is that while the work of God was going on, the people were going to be cared for at the same time. So often in the past I've seen the people of God sacrificed for the work. Have you ever seen that? In other words, is that the overall importance is the work. And what happens is the people get put aside. And that's what the church really is. That's the ecclesia. That's the body, is the people. Is that the individual can never be sacrificed for the organization. If any church or any organization reaches that point, then it has lost track of the purpose of its duty. And I remember way back hearing one of the ministers at a headquarters in a meeting of a conflict, knowing that they had done wrong to an individual. The church knew it, they had done wrong. The problem is that the individual was correct in what he did. But if they recognized what he did, it would set a precedent that a member had the right to challenge a minister's decision. And they couldn't have that kind of precedent out there in the ranks. Have you ever been through something like that? And so the problem is that they knew the principle of God said to do this. The minister was wrong, but if they said the minister was wrong, it sets a precedent, and the more people are going to challenge the ministry. Well, that's a pitiful way to look at it. And so what happens is they sacrifice the individual for the integrity of an organization. And you've probably seen that in your lifetime. And I've seen that many, many years ago when I first came up and I got involved with something like that. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The individual can never be sacrificed for an organization. Understand that. The integrity of the individual is the root of the work of God. Because that individual is a future child of God, to be born into the kingdom. And that is tantamount to spiritual abortion, to just sacrifice and cut off an individual. It reached the point that the organization, this was way, way back, there's no local organization, no independence, so nobody think I'm picking on anybody else. At that point is that if you were not in an organization, it was told, and this was the world, if you were not in that organization, then you, in essence, were not going to be in the kingdom. It was that simple. And it was a way of controlling individuals. And you look in the New Testament, that's the way the Pharisees dealt with the people in their day. And it's very well the same principle that goes forward. So Nehemiah, in the midst of all what was going on, and I gave you that story to show you what Nehemiah focused on. As important as the work he had to do for building those walls, at the point of threatening his life and those around him, he never forsook the need of the individual. And chapter 5 is the inset that brings in and tells us the conditions of what he does. So I just want to cover a little bit of that. In verse 1 in chapter 5 it says, "And there was a great outcry of the people and their wives against the Jewish brethren, for there were theirs who said, We and our sons and our daughters are many. Therefore let us get grain that we may eat and live." People were literally starving to death because the conditions were so bad. And there were also some of them who said, "We have mortgaged our lands, our vineyards, and our houses that we might buy grain because of the famine." And so they were beginning to sell their homes and their families. So there were also those who said, "We have borrowed money for the king's taxes on our lands and vineyards. Yet our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, and our children as their children. And indeed, we're forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves." He brings this condition to Nehemiah. So this is what we're dealing with here. So Nehemiah calls for the leadership. In verse 9, he says, "It's not good what you guys are doing." I mean, he's just stood up right to the plate. And he said, "This is not good what you guys are doing. Should you not walk in the fear of our God for the reproach of our nation and our enemies?" I mean, he had no bones telling them what was going on. It says, "I also with my brethren and my servants am lending them money and grain. Please let us stop usury." And I will hear from time to time people in the church want to lend to someone in their church and they want to charge them interest. Jesus Christ says you don't do that. You help your brother. And so Nehemiah brings them to the point. He says, "Listen, guys, this is wrong what you're doing." He says, "You're no different than the rest of the world." He says, "You're selling your children into slavery." He says, "Didn't we just come out of slavery?" And he refers back to the time when they came and they were slaves in Egypt. And he tells them to stop doing what they were doing. And the people surprisingly said, so they said, "We will restore it and will require nothing from them and will do as you say." It was a time in history. And this is why I think it has a lot to do with a type of duality in prophecy that we're going to see in the millennial time, in the rebuilding that goes forward, where people will, because everybody's not going to be converted going into that 1,000-year reign. You can look at Zechariah in chapter 14 and see that. And you can see that there's going to be an army raised up against Christ. So there's going to be a lot of people who are going to think they're going to be taken advantage. You can look at the conditions around New Orleans and see that there are people out there trying to take advantage of other people. I mean, it's unbelievable what you're seeing. There's human nature out there. Nehemiah's character, he goes on to remove any question of his integrity. He makes no bones about telling them what they're supposed to do, and then he brings it back to himself. And in the same chapter, verse 14, it says, "Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year unto the 13th year of King Xerxes, 12 years neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provisions." There was money, there was a position, there was things that he was entitled to as the governor of that province. And he's telling them, he says, "Listen, not only am I telling you it's wrong to do this," he says, "I'm telling you I don't do it either." And he just lays it out there. No bones about it. He tells them right up front. He says that neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provisions. But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people, and he took from them bread and wine, and besides 40 shekels of silver. Yes, even their servants bore rule over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. The man's heart and his integrity was correct. He did what he knew to be right. In verse 16, it says, "I also continued in the work of this wall, and we did not buy any land, and all my servants were gathered there for work." And then you'll see that the house that he was living in is quite possibly the house he was living in was actually the palace of the king, because he wasn't there yet and he had to rebuild it also. But when you see how many people ate at his table, I don't remember off the top of my head, the next few verses will tell you, but I think it's about 150 people a minimum a day, and how much food they had to have to feed those workers. And all he took was enough food to feed those people that was with him. He didn't take any pay, and he just served, diligently served those people. Now, that's like an inset chapter between the worker and his dedication. But he's showing you that as important as his job was, when the need of the people arose, he had to deal with that because that took more precedent. Now remember, they tried to stop him from the wall. And look, in chapter 6, he's going to show you, should I stop this great work to go talk to you? But he stopped what he was doing to go care for the needs of the individual. Now that's awful important, and it's overlooked. And if we as God's people, all of God's people, realize that the individual need is more important than the collective need of an organization, if we can focus on that first, God will bless whatever the need is to the church. Always, every single time, I have no doubt about it. The focus of the individual takes priority over any other need, a person's life. That can never be compromised. And that was one of the examples of chapter 5 that I pull out of this. Now, back to his dedication in chapter 6. And now it so happened that when Sanballat, now if you go look in history, just as a little side note, Sanballat, his name is written in the Elephantine Papyrus, that somewhere around 407, he also was governor of Samaria. So from this time on, he's not finished, even though Nehemiah is accomplishing his task. He goes on, and you'll see that Samaria is just almost a stone's throw away from Jerusalem. And you find him that he is also the governor. And they found this in the Aramaic documents they found in the 5th century B.C., and they were recovered from the Jewish military colony that was stationed at Answa on the southern borders of Egypt. And that's a historical record today. Actually, they still have that over there. So actually, that's just a little side information if you want to go back and start studying who these people were, because it's interesting who these people were. And we'll bring out something out in just a second of another person. Now, it so happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, Gershom, the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall and that there were no breaks left in it, though at that time we had not hung the gates, that Sanballat and Gershom, now, some people pronounce that Gashmu. You'll find he is the same person in verse 6 when we come to verse 6. Now, this person is one who is willing to testify under oath that to a lie, which is one of the next phases, you'll see, of attacks against the work of God. If they can't discourage you, if they can't raise up forces to defeat you, they will begin to destroy character. If that doesn't work, they will begin to raise up people who will lie against you to stop the work. And I'll show you 2 examples in the New Testament before I close. Because that's the same. Satan doesn't change his tactics. He may use little different things, but he's pretty much the same thing. The goal is to destroy the work. If he can't destroy the work, destroy the individual. If he can't destroy the individual direct, we'll go around the back door, we'll destroy his integrity, so no one will ever listen to him. It's incredible, because that's the pattern from the Old Testament to the New Testament. They did it to Christ, and they did it to Stephen. I'll show you that in just a minute. So now, let's go on. Now, Gashmu, if you go look into history, this fellow Gershom is also Gashu. It's the same person. From verse 1 and verse 6 is actually the same person. His name means rainstorm. It's kind of interesting when you all of a sudden, have you found yourself up with opposition, you just felt like this huge whirlwind just destroyed everything around you? Well, his name means rainstorm. He's been identified historically, by most theologians believe this, and it may not be true, and when you give history, when you go back and you look, you're going to find all kind of different pieces of information. But most of them believe that he was an Arabian king, because his name is recorded in history somewhere around 450 BC, about the same time of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And so what they're trying to say here is, when we get to verse 6, that this man, the Arabian, was a king, and he's willing to testify that you're about to do something to go against the king, Xerxes. Now, this is just not anybody here. And we're talking about someone who has power and has got clout. It would be like you going into court and having to stand up against a senator. And they say, well, you said, and then they bring in this senator and says, this man is willing to testify. And what shot you got now? I mean, everybody knows who he is. You have no credibility. Who are you? You're a feeble Jew. You keep the Sabbath day. You keep these holy days. You're part of the problem. So you see the scenario? So if we can put the scriptures in light of how it affects life today, it makes it a little more understandable. All right, so now he goes on. In verse, I'll pick up now in verse 3. So I sent message to them saying, I am doing a great work so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? Now remember chapter 5, he actually stopped to go take care of the people. But now that they're after him to go stop the work, he says, I'm not going to leave this work and come down and talk to you. But they sent me this message 4 times. They came to him to try to get him to go down and talk to him. But I answered in the same manner. And then Sanballat sent his servant to me as before the 5th time. This time he had an open letter in his hand. And it was written, it is reported among the nations in Gasham or Gashmu, says that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall, and that you may be their king. Now, have you been through that before? He says, oh, he's just saying all these things because he wants to be in charge. So that's what they're saying now. They said, we're going to take this information, and we're telling them the reason you're building this is because you want to be their king. And you have also anointed prophets to proclaim concerning you at Jerusalem, saying, and the reason they're saying this about the prophets is because anyone who claimed to be king, normally there was a prophet of God who actually made the statement. And so what they're trying to say is that you've anointed prophets to tell them that you're the king. In other words, you bought these people off so that you can be their king. And that's why you're down here. He goes on to say that the saying that there is a king in Judah. Now these matters will be reported to the king. Now he says, you wouldn't come talk to us? Well, let me tell you what we're going to do. We're going to go tell the king that you have appointed prophets and that you're going to be their king and that you're going to rebel against the king, Xerxes, the fellow who sent him down there. He was the cupbearer. Now that's what he's up against, saying that there is a king in Judah. In verse 8 he goes on to say, then I sent to them saying, no such thing as you are saying is being done. But you invent them in your own heart. For they are trying to make us afraid, saying their hands will be weakened in the work, and it will not be done. Therefore, God strengthen my hands. Every single time he finds opposition, he goes to God in prayer. But he never stops his task. He never stops. No matter what it is. Now they're conspired. Now this would get him killed. This literally would get him killed. If they went to this king and that king believed him, it had all the makings of what looked like it could be a rebellion coming. He had the power. He had the position. He was building Jerusalem. These people literally put their lives on the line to work with him. All it needed was another king from another nation to come forward and saying, this man is going to testify what you're doing. It looks credible. And all he says, it's in your imagination. I didn't do it. And he goes to God and goes back to work. Incredible. The man was convicted of what he had to go through. Verse 10, and it says, afterwards I came to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Deliah, the son of Mehetabel, who was a secret informant. He said, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us close the doors of the temple, for they're coming to kill you. Now, the last thing is to protect his life. They actually brought someone in and said, listen, you need to go hide. You need to go protect yourself. If he would have done that, he would have lost the respect and the credibility of everyone around him. He would have sought to save his own life. But remember what he just told everybody before. When their lives was on the line in chapter 6, he says, these people are coming in to kill us. You fight, and God will protect us. What do you think would have happened if he'd have listened to this person and went and hid himself and hid? He'd had absolutely no respect. The work would have been over. The very last thing that Satan will bring to attack you individually or to the work or anyone else is your life. Now remember, I asked the question, what are you afraid to lose? Is there anything that you're afraid to lose? And if there is, God knows it. Let me tell you one more thing. In all probability, Satan knows it too. Satan knows it too. And he will search your soul to find your weaknesses. And he will try to just work into those weaknesses. And he will go step by step trying to wear you out. One problem after the next. One complication after the next. Lies, attacks, deceit. And when all else fails, just like with Job, he says, oh, he only serves you because you protect his life. And you give him all these things. And God says, okay, you can take everything but his life. And so it comes to when you do the work of God. It's a personal, individual thing. The messages laid out here are very clear. Is that when you have a task to do, if you've been baptized, you have a task to do. You don't have a choice. You can't take it back and say, oh, I made a mistake. I don't want to do this anymore. You have made a commitment before God. Your baptism is eternal. It is something that you said, I will. Supposedly at that time you were supposed to count the cost. The cost is, and you go through what that cost is, and who says, even to the point of losing your life. Most people are not going to ever be brought to that point. But you must be willing to be at that point if need be. Because God knows our weaknesses, and he says he's never going to give you more than you can handle. So you need to know that no matter what happens. In fact, I could go there. I won't go there now because of time. Let's go back and read Daniel about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When he came to him and he said, listen, you're going to worship our king. And they said, no, we're not. He said, if you don't do it, then we'll kill you. And he said, well, we believe that God will save us. But if he doesn't, forbid, we are not going to bend our knee to you, no matter what happens to us. All right, that's just a little side point, but I'm just trying to bring out some personal objectives and showing how commitment is important, each one of us today, whether we realize it or not. All right, now, he goes on, and he says, in verse 11, should such a man as I flee? And who is there, such as I, who would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. There's not a thing they can do him. There's not a thing they can hurt him with. And he went on and did the work of God. In verse 15, I'll just skip over to 15. It says, so the wall was finished in the 25th day of Elul, and in 52 days. And it so happened that when our enemies heard it, and all the nations around us saw the kings, that they were disheartened in their eyes, and they perceived that this was the work of God. This work was done by our God. Now, the last point to this, and then I want to go to the New Testament just briefly, is that he never took credit for it, if you noticed. He said, this is the work of God. It wasn't Nehemiah's work. It wasn't even Ezra, who was his contemporary. He said that when the enemies realized they couldn't stop what was going on, it was the work of God. And that was his focus. He was doing a work. He said this is a great work. And people might say, well, you know what? That sounds pretty pretentious and bold for an individual to say that. And I believe what we're doing is a great work. Not because it's us, not because of any one individual, but the work is great because it's God's work, not ours. It's the individuals that's involved. It's God's people. And I don't know of any work on the face of the earth that's any greater than that. Not that we're great, because we're not. When you look around, you see what's going on, you see all your frailties. But the work itself of converting people to God's way is a great work. I don't know of anything greater. Jesus Christ himself said, greater works than you will do than these. And look at all the works he did. He had crippled people walk. The blind see. He raised the dead. And he said to his apostles, you're going to do greater works than these. Jesus Christ never had one single convert on the face of the earth before he died. And so when Jesus looked at a great work, he's not talking about physical works. He's talking about the conversion process of a person becoming from this mortal, carnal human being to the spirit-led, begotten Son of God, ready to be born into the kingdom. And that's what our job is. And that is part of the work, as I mentioned in part 1 and 2. Now, the attacks on God's people. Let me just briefly give you the process. And you can go back and you can read these yourself, and hopefully you'll take notes. You'll see in Acts chapter 6. Let me just read a couple of verses there. Is Acts chapter 6, it says in I'll start reading in verse 9. This is dealing with Stephen. It says, "And there arose some of what is called of the synagogue of freedmen, Cyrenians, Alexandrians, and those from Sicily and Asia, disputing with Stephen. But they were not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit by which he spoke." Now remember, they couldn't dispute what Nehemiah was doing. The conflict, the conflict's always what starts off with. They could not dispute what Stephen was telling them. Who was he talking to? The religious leaders of that day. Those who were the authorities. These were the type of the Sanballat, Tobias of that day. If they could not dispute him. So what they did, the very next verse, in verse 11 it says, "And they secretly induced men to say, 'We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God.'" Of course, he didn't do that. But they suborned witnesses to lie that he did. Threaten him. Chapter 6, verse 12. What did they do? They began to raise up, just like Sanballat did, those around the nations. All those nations we read? Well, now, it's the same process. They stirred up the people. They couldn't stop him personally, so what they want to do? They go around others and say, let's join forces. Let's conspire to stop this man. Isn't that what they did with Nehemiah? It was the same way. In verse 13, it says, "They also set up false witnesses." Remember Gashmu. With Gashmu, they said, well, you know what? This man's going to testify and lie about what you did. So now they're saying, we got false witnesses, we suborned them, and they're going to testify against you. Same process. Now, what was the last one? The last concept of the attack that Satan comes to you is your own life, remember? They threatened Nehemiah. Well, in Stephen's case, God's heavens opened up. He never backed away, and God allowed him to die. There was not a thing they could do to stop Stephen. Not a thing. After they killed him, his work was even greater, because now he became the first martyr of the New Testament, and I'm telling you his story from the pulpit 2,000 years later. There's not a thing they could do to stop Stephen. And in fact, God magnified his work. So you see the comparison of what took place. It's the same thing. You and I go through it, and if you can look at it in the perspective of what's going on, you'll find in your personal life you have been through these processes. You may have not to the point that they've threatened your life, but maybe one day you will. Now, with Jesus Christ, the same way with him. And you can go back into Matthew 26, and you will find the general process exactly the same. They conspired. And you can go verses 1 through 5, and it says in chapter 26, verse 1, "And it came to pass, when Jesus had finished these sayings, they said to his disciples," well, let me go to verse 3 to save time. "Then the chief priests and the scribes and the elders and the people assembled at the palace of the high priest, who is called Caiaphas, and they plotted to take Jesus by trickery and to kill him." So they began the conspiring. You'll see the previous chapters. They confronted him, and they were not able to confound him, just like Stephen. And when they couldn't hit him face on, what they do? They go behind your back, and they conspire to create lies to stop what it is you're doing. And of course, you go all the way down. You'll see, you can read in verse 59 and verse 60, "And they found people now who are willing to lie." These suborned witnesses, they found people who are willing to lie. He said, "This fellow said that I am able to destroy the temple and to build it in 3 days." Well, that isn't what Jesus said. But that's the lie that they spread. In fact, you can go back, you can read it in John. The reference was to John 2, verse 19 and 20, where Jesus Christ told them, "You destroy this temple," referring to his body, "and in 3 days I'll build it up." They twisted that, they perverted it, and said, "You said you're going to destroy the temple, and in 3 days you'll build it back up again." That's not what he said. But they testified to a lie so they can bring him to court and kill him. Same process. Same process. And you can go through in your life and you will look at those same things that was going on there. The book of Nehemiah leaves so many spiritual principles. And somewhere I'm going to come back to, because I want to pick up a little later, because you see, there's prophetic things that took place that we see in the duality. And what I'm going to begin to do is I'm going to have to come back into here into the church building during the middle of the week, and I was talking with Jeff. And what we want to do is I want to, inside of myself, I wanted to for a long time, is be able to have the equipment needed to be able to do a Bible study style so that when we come in, I can actually do this. There probably won't be anybody here. Anybody's welcome to come. But I want to, for the churches, to build this in a historical and a biblical format so that when it's on tape, when I refer to references into history, it will show up on the screen, and Jeff and I have been working on some of this now, multi-layered, just like it is in a newsroom, where it will come up and it will show you in the screen graphs, pictures, historical statements and comments, and pictures as we go through this to lay this out in a Bible study style that a person can go through and look at home. Because you see, time's coming that we're not all going to be able to get to church every single week. And we need to have as much information on the insight of the future of what lies ahead so that when our people are confronted with problems, they can go to God's Word to give them the strength. And even if they can't get to church on Saturday, they can get into God's Word every single day, some kind of way, with the insight of the prophecies and the problems that they're going to encounter, and they can study at home. So we're going to be doing some of that as we go through that in the future. And I want to go through at least one more thing in the story of Nehemiah from a Bible study prophetic point. Because toward the end, what's really incredible in this book is people don't realize it because it says Nehemiah is a book at the end on history. It's the very last of the history going into the return of Christ in the New Testament. But if we don't understand that it may be more than that, it's in all probability in the duality of a prophetic book, of what it's like in the conditions before the return of Christ, we miss what's going on. Because there is a verse, when it's all said and done, when the walls are rebuilt, when the city's been reestablished, the sacrifices have been put in place, and the city is ready to rebuild, Nehemiah tells everybody, he says, now send out to all those who are still scattered around Jerusalem and to the other nations and bring back 1 in 10. How often does the Bible refer to, at the end time, when Jesus Christ actually stands on the foot of this earth, that we have only a tithe of the people left that are going to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild again to begin the 1,000 years? And we see Nehemiah doing that. Sending out to bring back 1 in 10 who have been brought out and captured and scattered around to come back, bring 1 in 10. Very similar to what we see in prophecy when Jesus Christ comes back and the establishment of his 1,000-year reign. And I just wanted to leave that with you, give you some thought that there's a lot more in Nehemiah than we've probably considered, give you something to think about, to go home and study. And who knows, maybe you'll come up with some stuff and we can sit together and discuss it. And we'll come back in sometime in the near future and we'll talk about Nehemiah, Part 5.